and welcome to the Anti-Cut podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Ellie May Taylor, and we are back to preview the 2024 F1 Academy season, which kicks off this weekend in Saudi Arabia. And when I say we, I mean all three of us as we go through everything you need to know ahead of the new season. I'm joined by Jesse Billington and Thiemo Albers-Daly. How are you both?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Had an interesting day up Birmingham Way driving a Rover P5B Coupe, the ministerial car of choice for a variety of prime ministers in the UK through the years, and absolute boat of a thing, but very enjoyable with that Buick-derived 3.5-litre V8, a proper car.
I've not had quite that adventurous a day, and I'm not even going to get into picking that apart for all the different interesting things that are going on there, but I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I think I've had a pretty normal, maybe a bit dull day. So we'll just get into it instead. And we'll start off with the ART drivers of Bianca Bustamante, Leah Block, and Uriel Nobels. Out of those three drivers, is there any of them that stand out to you or looking forward to seeing?
Aurélie Nobel's certainly Ferrari Junior Academy driver, so she's not got the sort of backing of the main Scuderia sort of emblazoned on her car in the same way that Maya Wake will. She's got the backing from the Scuderia, and it's going to be interesting to see how she performs. Certainly against the lineup, I think she's sort of coming into this from a slightly different footing, but yeah, something sort of stands out to me as one that's already been talent scouted by one of the major teams and in with a good chance, certainly.
Bianca Bustamante is a driver who we know what she can do and what potential she has, so I'm just intrigued to see how she builds on what she did last season. For me, the interesting one for the team is Leah Block, just because aside from the GT Winter Series that she's just finished competing in, we don't really have much experience with her in single seater still. She's obviously from a rally and off-road background, so it's going to be fascinating to see how that translates over to this form of racing instead. And nice to see that she's got the backing of Williams. They are very much in a phase where I feel like they've got to try a little bit of everything to see what works for them, and they kind of show that they're being bold with their choices in that respect. So I'm on board with it, and I just hope that it works out for her. But again, it's not often we see that jump into such a vastly different category in terms of racing, but intrigued to see how that'll go. What about you? Any one of the three sticking out in particular?
Yeah, I sort of agree with Block. Obviously, it is sort of her first year in sort of a single-seater championship, but like you said, she's a very good driver across multiple sort of disciplines, and youngest person to be crowned champion in the American Rally Association Open two-wheel drive class. So it'll be interesting to see what she can do this year and how well she takes to sort of single-seaters, and hopefully she can sort of use this year to embed herself well into sort of the series, and then hopefully then next year, given the opportunity, she can grow upon that, or maybe she just hits the ground running. We don't know. I mean, in ART, the only sort of known entity to F1 Academy is Bianca Bustamante, because obviously she was in it last season, and this year Campos, they sort of have a more well-known single-seater people within sort of the F1 Academy in Carrie Schreiner, Chloe Chambers, and Nerea Marti. Who out of those three sort of catches your eye?
It's interesting that Nerea Marti is the only driver they're carrying over from last year, which obviously is good for her because it shows confidence in each other. And for me, whilst the driving bit I'll get to in a second, I just absolutely love the Tommy Hilfiger livery on that car, and the race suit. It is very nice, and I think it's my favorite one of the lot. And she's proven herself to be quite a capable driver, both in W Series and then in F1 Academy. So I think she's going to be one of these drivers that's not overlooked, but I think should be getting more attention than she probably is getting at the moment, because everyone's going to be looking at where have they gone? At Bianca, they're going to be looking at Handler Kubasi, they're going to be looking at Dorian Pin. And whilst fair enough for looking at those drivers, I feel like Nerea Marti could be one of these drivers who's just quietly, confidently there in the background and doing enough. And we've seen in other feeder series that you don't need to be on the top step every weekend to win the championship. You just need to be consistently getting points on the board. And I think she could be someone to do that. And she's got a lot of experience now. So that's who's going to stand out for me. I know that Chloe James is going to stand out for the Haas chat for obvious reasons. But again, she's done a lot of racing in single-seaters in the US as well. So that's going to be interesting. And Carrie Schreiner, mixed bag of a year last year. So kind of like you were saying with Bianca, it's going to be interesting to see how that second year then develops in terms of what can you apply from last year to see if that's going to be a big improvement, or is it going to be rinse and repeat? Hopefully not for her sake, but it's always interesting, especially when she's coming from originally, I think it's a GT, more endurance style racing background.
I think with Carrie Schreiner, almost her sort of biggest rival is going to be Dorian Pinn, in the fact that they come from similar backgrounds, having done GT and sports car racing before. So they're both coming from sort of, I want to say level playing field, but certainly sort of familiar playing fields to one another. I think it'll be interesting to see how both of them are able to make this adaptive shift towards sort of single seaters. And obviously they've been dabbling in winter series and sort of F4 series across the globe, just sort of getting onto an even keel ahead of this year. But yeah, the Tommy Hilfiger livery is a really, really good looking livery. It is one of the good liveries of this year, just across motorsport in general. So looking forward to seeing that out on track.
Not that I disliked any of the other ones in particular, but I saw that and thought, ooh, yes.
It's good looking for sure. And I think Nerea Marti, she did have some good races last year in F1 Academy. Did she win the first race at Paul Ricard?
Yes, she did. I really should know that, and yes, she did. Yeah, no, that was a pretty good win for her. And again, it's like I was saying, there was such a competitive edge to everything in the season last year that I feel like some drivers can get overlooked a little bit in the same way that maybe Jess Edgar was, even though she came strong towards the end. But that doesn't mean they should be forgotten or counted out of being a title contender.
Yeah, I definitely say that sort of from the Campos line, I'm interested to see what Chloe Chambers can do actually with the Haas backing. And this is like the first time Haas have really had a proper junior sort of set of drivers. Everyone else they've got has sort of just been poached from Ferrari Driver Academy. So it's going to be interesting to see what they start to do with their own young lineup, especially as they try and revitalise themselves this year. So I think there's more to the Chloe Chambers story than simply the fact that she's sort of competing in this year's F1 Academy. And I think it's good enough as it is. She's a fantastic driver. But I think there's an interesting broader scope to sort of what she's going to be able to achieve and equally what Haas are going to be able to achieve with her. And I think it's going to be useful from both sides there.
And sort of completely opposite from Haas, and sort of that they usually poach Ferrari sort of drivers. You've got sort of the Red Bull driver backing of the Alcabasi sisters and Emily De Hoos for MP Motorsport. What do you think of sort of those three drivers?
It's the only team that's not changed from last year, which is quite interesting. And it's a Red Bull. I'm not even sure it's not B team, C team. What letter do we give it at this point? Because we're just going down the formula there to attach a letter to it because they've got drivers everywhere. But it's kind of they were a very solid team in F1 Academy last year, and I can understand why MP wanted to keep them. And it does seem a logical choice for Red Bull as a collective to go for those three in slightly different ways. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Hamza obviously don't need to stay much on her. She proved herself more than capable, and I find it interesting that she's come back here for a second season rather than going off to Freca, because she did have the opportunity for that. Amna, I think, is going to be one of those drivers. She comes across to me as one of those two-season drivers that we see in other feeder series where you have that first year to bed yourself in, learn the ropes, and then in the second season you go for it. So I'm quietly confident for her, and DeHoos is a solid driver as well. It's we thought it would be, I think you and I discussed this last year a bit, Justin, we thought she would be overshadowed maybe a bit by the Alcabasi sisters, but she held her own pretty decently over the course of the season and proved why she deserves to be there. And the three of them, if you see any of their social media, they get on as thick as thieves. So it's nice to have that off-track relationship that you like seeing them all get along and then throwing all of that out the window as soon as they get in the car.
Yeah, I think Amna is going to be, and I say this in a very positive tone, she's going to be a bit of a Zane Maloney, sort of comes into the sport, gets one season.
I could only take that in a positive way.
And then sort of the second season really comes out kicking. And we've seen that with Zane over in F2. This is sort of starting his second full season in it and absolutely smoking it. And I think Amna, I think now she's sort of got feet under the table. She's got the backing of RB. Hamda's got Red Bull Racing, and then Emily de Hoos's Red Bull Driver Academy. So essentially, it's not one of the main teams, but she's still got the official Red Bull title behind her. It's great to see that level of sort of impact and drive from Red Bull as well, how seriously they are taking F1 Academy and sort of making a proper stand of going, okay, look, these are genuinely very talented racing drivers. It makes sense to put them into our driver pool, because whatever we do with them, if we put them into sort of Red Bull based GT or endurance or F1 and single seater stuff, they are valuable and useful drivers to have. They are high performing.
And they seem like the kind
talented
of drivers as well that would easily slip from one category to another with relative ease and be solid on the ground. Even if they're not at the top straight away, they'd be fairly decent.
You could rely on them to get a fairly good sort of result if you were to sort of chuck them at like a 6 hours of Spa or something. You'd be sort of walking away with a good handful of points and go, you know what, for a first outing doing GT racing, that's pretty solid. And they've got an air of really just competitive and sort of complete drivers in that sense. Yeah.
What about you, Eddie, mate? Any standing out?
For me, I think it's sort of the same as you as Hamda Al-Khabaisi. I mean, she fought with Lena Bula sort of for second in the championship last year. Very good driver. She's in my predictions later on, so
We'll leave it for that then.
We will leave it at that, and we'll move on to a whole new lineup for Prema in Tina Hulsman, Dorian Pin, and Maya Wom. I think I know who we're all looking forward to in this one, but I'll let you guys say.
Oh, for me,
I think Jesse's going to bet his money on the team and hope that they don't do a feeder series in F2 and F3, because he's going to be devastated otherwise.
Yeah, we'll get to that when we get to like my season-long predictions, because Prema have a great ability for spotting good talent and progressing it. They've done it so well across the years with Formula 3, Formula 2. They did a pretty good job of things last year. That's why they're the chosen team for drivers to move to when they move to Freca. They are a really solid team, and they have got some absolutely class talent lined up this year. I think Tina Hausman, really interesting sort of pick there, and looks to be a very promising driver. I think 2 years in F1 Academy is really going to round her out as a driver, and when she makes what I'm thinking is going to be an inevitable step towards Freca or F3, perfect. She'll come out of this as a very well-rounded driver. The other two almost come into this as very well-rounded drivers. Certainly Dorian Pin, with the sort of backing of Iron Lynx, having spent a lot of time in endurance and sports car racing. So she has got a fantastic track record and a fantastic CV coming onto this already. This is basically going to be sort of her finishing school, as it were. And I think that things are hopefully going to progress very quickly for her. She's got the Mercedes backing, and it's going to be interesting to see what Mercedes do with her, especially as the concept of who goes into their seats in a few years' time becomes more and more in flux. Maya Way is very much an interesting concept. She's been on Ferrari's radar for quite a long time.
She's also a person rather than a concept.
No, but conceptually, what Ferrari are going to be looking to do with her, because they've had sort of her in their driver academy for quite some time and genuinely spent a lot of time and effort on actually forming her into a very sort of complete entity as a racing driver. There is a lot to be sort of unlocked with what can happen for her next. She's got a very good career coming up. It's going to be interesting to see what she's able to make of it through Formula One Academy.
I think the only downside for this team and these drivers is, and you show it with your enthusiasm for them, is that there's going to be more potential pressure and more expectation on them potentially than any of the other drivers on the grid, which means that not that if they get anything less than a win, we're going to be throwing all of our toys out the pram or anything, but for them, that's going to be something that they're either going to have to manage in a certain way, or they're just going to be, or it's going to be well-founded and they just deliver straight away and it's going to be a boring season and they get 1, 2, 3 every single race. But I think that's the only thing that could be not undoing as such, but throw a spanner in the works there. And I think everyone's got to remember that all three of them, whilst talented and worthy of being here, as they've shown in other categories and from backings that they've received, they're still very young and still it's an academy. They're not in Formula 2 for whatever reason. They need to still work on honing their racecraft and get all of these things. They've proven that they deserve to be there, but they're still very much learning and developing. So I think as long as people don't run away with the notion of, well, if it's not them, then they're clearly not as good as everyone thought they were. We should spin them off immediately. It's like, no. They're good and they've proven to be here. but it's not necessarily going to be running out the gates with it, because this is still the next step up or something very different for some of them. And I think that's just trying to make sure that gets balanced so that no one. I hate it when drivers get overhyped, not for a wrong reason, but then it's just there's nothing they can do to match up to that when they're still doing perfectly well.
Yeah, I think there's hype to them, certainly. The interesting one with Tina Houseman certainly is the Aston Martin backing. And Aston have been sort of dabbling in female drivers. And this is an interesting point to sort of drop this in, is because Jess Hawkins has been teasing and leading up to something that's coming up this weekend. And a lot of curiosity around it. I chucked it up on our Instagram story and said, FP1 drive.
It's replacing Lance Stroll.
We don't know yet, but I sort of put up one.
A man can dream.
I reposted one of her images with FP1 drive, and there was a cheeky like from Jess Hawkins. So I'm like, okay, I don't know if she just sort of likes my optimism or if she's that's sort of an admission of something's coming up. But it's interesting to see that there are broader plans afoot for some of the teams as well, like genuinely taking on board what F1 Academy and its sort of former iteration as W Series have had to offer, and proven that these steps are happening for drivers as they progress beyond these series. It's great to see that these things are clicking into place eventually, and the rate at which
I think the last thing I was going to say on them is that I don't want them to suffer from what I'm going to coin as the Abby Pudding syndrome from last year. She had such a good time in W Series on debut, and then during the last season of that everyone was expecting her to be really up there last year, and she didn't do badly, but I don't think she did as well as a lot of people thought she might do. And part of that was down to the fact that it was a very tight field, as we saw all year. It was kind of everyone got their moment of glory at some point or another in many different ways. And I think Abby is still a very strong driver, but again, you don't want to have what happened to her or the perception of what happened to her happen to these three. You just want it to be turn it down a notch, but just be quietly excited for them. Don't judge them if they have one or two bad races to start off with, because they're still learning the ropes. And I don't want to bring up this part of this topic necessarily, but it's worth just mentioning slightly of how much would you be focusing on the results as much if they were just other drivers in F2 or F3, for example. How much are you basing it on gender, perhaps?
I mean, when you look at sort of how
not you personally, generally,
but generally speaking, yes, certainly. But I mean, sort of when you look at how into F2 and F3 people get, I think it's fair to say that sort of level of excitement's there. But you mentioned Abby Pulling; she comes up next to our list with Rodin, and she's also racing this year alongside F1 Academy in GB4. So she's got a busy season ahead. I mean, a lot of these drivers are doing sort of double shifts across the year. I know that Dorian Pin has stuck around with WEC. She's doing a couple of races with Iron Lynx. So again, there's a lot on these drivers' plates. So you'd be overstepping the mark to really sort of criticize them on sort of having an unbusy or too busy season or a bad season because they're distracted elsewhere. They are throwing themselves full time into multiple racing series in some of these instances. So mistakes are going to crop up. Drivers are going to be tired and exhausted. They're not just competing across the sort of 8 rounds, or I think it is, that you'll see on the standard W Series F1 Academy calendar.
And a lot of these drivers are also still very young as well. And I think we need to sort of keep that as a sort of factor as well. But seeing as we've sort of spoken a bit about Abby Pulling, we may as well speak about her other two teammates in Jessica Edko and Lola Lovenfoss. And for me, I think the really interesting one, or something that we should mention, is how Lola Lovenfoss has the backing of Charlotte Tilbury. I think that's huge for the sport. It's sort of a way of breaking down barriers in what's sort of typically known as sort of a masculine sport. And it shows that women can be both. We can be sort of what is typically known as sort of being girly, but also like motorsport. And I think that's sort of an incredible way to sort of start.
It's something I think Samantha Tan and, I'm forgetting the other driver over in America now, but there's one other driver who they've kind of flirted with the idea of this a little bit and having that crossover in terms of at least the social media showing the both, that, like you say, you can be both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. But this is the first proper kind of statement piece we've seen, it feels like. Although I feel like there was something else prior to this. Was there something with Macau Grand Prix and Bianca Bustamante?
She had a
Bustamante
sponsor, yeah.
Yeah, had I can't remember the name of them now.
My makeup game's not as strong as it used to be, so I'm not remembering the the company that got involved. But again, it seems like that helped open the door, and this is definitely smashing it open in a way of showing, yes, these two can be combined, and it's not a weird thing.
Anastasia. Something.
Are you naming singers?
Anastasia Beverly Hills.
Yeah.
That was it. Okay, perfect. But yeah, it feels like the natural successor to that. So it's interesting to see, and will be interesting to see as well who else from that industry follows suit in the future. And they're all going to be paying attention.
And if Charlotte Tilbury would like to sponsor me, I wouldn't say no, because 90% of my
podcast
them. Yeah, all the podcast. I'm sure you guys love Charlotte Tilbury makeup too.
I think my girlfriend.
I've been needing a new clutch bag if she's got any of those. I don't know where the limits are.
I mean, we haven't mentioned Jessica Edgar either. She's got backing. Well, she's joined the Rodin team. She's got some general sponsors across her car at the moment, but there is a big sponsor that is reportedly in the pipeline to sort of back her car across the season. Unfortunately, it wasn't ready in time for Jeddah, but there are the general sort of consensus that it will be appearing later on, quite possibly in Miami in May. So it's great to see that all the drivers across this, the 15 drivers, obviously, plus the wildcard entries, but the main 15 drivers have all got really big sort of sponsorship backing and sort of this idea.
We were a little apprehensive when we knew that 10 teams would sponsor and what would happen to the 5, but the other 5 have come through in a big way, which is reassuring because it's one thing saying that it's going to happen, and then when we see that's a shame because we thought that would be a bit of a bigger player coming into support, but in this instance, it's hit the mark every single time.
Yeah, with the likes of sort of Red Bull's general sort of junior academy taking on Emily de Hursler, you look at sort of Tommy Hilfiger, who, bear in mind, are also one of the partners with Mercedes. Like, they are a name that is already a high-flying sponsor within the motorsport world. The same with the likes of Puma. These aren't sort of small names that have come along and just chucked a bit of money at a car to sort of have a sponsorship. They are properly well-established names that are taking F1 Academy seriously, and that's really nice to see, is the fact that it is, and this sounds really sort of almost sort of talk downish or sort of belittling to sort of say it's nice to see it being taken seriously, but it genuinely is. It's nice to see that this has got the proper standing that it needs to run alongside it, and it means that when you can compare it to other series, it stands on its own 2 feet against other series in that sort of respect. You look at the sponsors that appear on F2 cars and F3 cars. This is no different to that. You've got a different array of sponsors, certainly, but ultimately you look at the audience it appeals to. It makes sense to have those different sponsors because at the end of the day, motorsports is a business.
It is. And we may as well, before we sort of go any further into sort of F1 Academy, it's this season, we may as well speak about what is actually happening to the drivers that were in it last year, with Marta Garcia, who won it last year. She's taken up a Prema seat in FRECA, which is sort of the F3 racing series. It is a step up the ladder, and then vice champion of last year as well, Lena Bühler has also made the move to FRECA. She stays with ART and retains her Sauber backing. Juju Noda joins Super Formula, the first Japanese woman in the series, as well as the youngest driver to ever enter. She won the Italian F2000 series in her eponymous team last year.
She's a very exciting driver. She's very, very quick, and I'm hoping that she does as well in Super Formula as I think she will, because then I would quite like to see her make the jump over to F2 or F3, because we thought Yuki was a pocket rocket in the feeder series. He got nothing on her from what I've seen so far. She is just speed, and it's quite fun to just watch her race, and everyone just sees this quiet, small Japanese girl and doesn't necessarily think too much about her, and then she just does a John Wick and just blows them all out of the water, and it's just quite impressive to see that. So I'm very much looking forward to watching how that goes this year and trying to find the time to watch Super Formula on top of everything else now.
It's worth remembering as well, she is very young. Like, she
just turned 18
last month. Yeah. So when she was in W Series in 2022, she was 16. I think she was almost certainly the youngest driver on the grid, and out there properly hassling it with the sort of far more bigger experienced drivers, and then sort of moved over to Italian Formula, sort of brought over with her Noda Racing, and then kept plugging away with that, and then won the series on debut. So And F2000 is a pretty hot series. Like, you're looking at drivers that have come through it. I want to say Andrea Kimi Antonelli came through that. So to sort of come through F2000 in Italy and win it in your debut season, that is something damned impressive. And this year she's got Super Formula and she's juggling Boss GP as well on top of it, which is sort of an interesting little class, but a great way to get wheel time and track time. So really solid entry and one to certainly keep an eye on.
Lindsay Brewer also joins Youngers Hollinger Racing in the Indy Next for 2024, the first female US driver to compete in the category in 33 years. I say emphasis on the US because Jamie Chadwick was the first woman to join Indy Next when she joined it last year, and that was 12 years, but this will be her second season this year as well.
Yeah,
I've been waiting for this for a while because I say keep. It feels like I've just been doing it for the last couple of years, but it feels like a long couple of years looking at the updates going, when's she moving into Indy Next? Because it keeps feeling like that's the next natural thing, and it's just not happened yet. So I was very happy when that announcement came out. And obviously, Jamie, we don't really say too much about her because we love Jamie here and we want her to do well. And she's had her initial season in the category now, and hopefully she can get a bit further up the order. And as we've seen by some of the signings in IndyCar for this year, you can make the step up. And like from Formula 2 to Formula 1, if you win that or come in second place, you've got an automatic entry into that straight away by the look of things for this year at least. So who knows what the next couple of years could hold for her, but it could be quite interesting to see. And Lindsay Brewer as well, just no pressure there, but it'll just be interesting to see what she can do in this because she appears to have done decently enough so far. But again, this is kind of not saying you haven't been doing anything up to now, but this is where it really starts. And it's kind of when people start paying much more attention to your racecraft and your results. So that's going to be two very fun different drivers in different stages of their careers to watch for sure for this year.
I mean, previously she's done a bit of single-seater stuff as well, like Skip Barber Formula 4 is a really interesting sort of feeder series to look at, especially on sort of stateside when it's feeding into things like IndyCar and then USF Pro 2000 Championship. I want to say Logan Sargent might have dabbled in that. I think somewhere in my mind he might have done. So again, it's two really big sort of seasons that she's had previously. So she's making all the right steps and heading in the right directions. This is sort of a really good stepping stone. But when it comes to Jamie Chadwick, she's got a debut this year as well on circuit at Goodwood at the members meet next month in the Ken Miles Cup, the All Mustang Classic race, which will be very interesting to see because she'll be up against some very ferocious drivers out on track, a lot of World Touring Car drivers, a lot of sort of former F1 drivers as well, usually sort of rock up to this and have a bit of a bash. So a really interesting way to sort of test her mettle against a very broad array of drivers in what's going to be some very interesting machinery. So plenty more to see from Jamie Chadwick across the year if you peer beyond the realms of sort of conventional racing, let's say.
We'll move on now to looking more at this season and the super license points. So the winner of the 2024 season will receive 10 super license points, while the driver in second and third place will collect 7 and 5 points respectively. 3 points will be awarded to the driver who classifies in fourth, and the fifth place driver will receive 1 point. The win on a win in F1 Academy and Championship is on par with sort of Elm's IMSA LMP2 Championship win, the Indy Pro 2000, NASCAR Xfinity, and GB3. We did see in W Series that if you won, you got 15 points, 12 for second, 10 for third, and so on. So it has gone down.
That was one of the things, though, wasn't it, where you could either take those and leave or not get them and stay, I think, whereas this time you just get to keep them. But also the 2-year cap,
the 2-year clauses,
plus the fact that you win it kind of automatically means you'd leave and have somewhere higher up the ladder to go anyway. So it does sort of balance it out, but I think it's just also that I wanted to make the distinction.
Wow. I mean, with Formula 3, what you get 30 if you win. Formula 2, it's 40. So do you think they could have gone a little higher with the points regardless? Or do you think 10?
I want to know how many they give for Frecker now, because if we're looking at Marta going there, and if we say she's going to make it to F1, I want to see how that impacts, because then if Frecker's 20, if it's between 10 and 30, then it makes sense. But if it's
25,
less or more, okay, then I think acceptable.
Yeah, 25 for Frecker. If you win the hypercar class in WEC, you get 30, which is on par with the Formula E Championship or Formula 3. IndyCar and Formula 2 give you 40 points for a championship win. So it fits well within the rankings, while it does seem to be sort of a little bit lower than W Series by 5 points at its top end. It's still fairly reasonable. It is an F4 championship, essentially, and Formula 4 championships give 12 points to a championship winner. So in reality, it ought to be, if anything, sort of 2 points higher up just to be on par with that. But given that if you do win the championship, you also get immediate allocation to Frecker, I don't think the point allocation is too sort of demanding in that instance.
We also have a wildcard seat this year. You can go into that.
Which, in a further initiative designed to help strengthen the talent pool in the regions in which F1 Academy is going to be racing, this season the series will also introduce the wildcard entries, as you mentioned there, at select races across the calendar. So working with race promoters, F1 Academies will identify talented young women from the host region and offer them basically a wildcard entry, as you can probably guess, for that specific weekend. And where that happens, the reigning team champion, Prema, will operate that wildcard car, that's easy for me to say, in addition to their 3 entries, and offer support and training to the selected driver. And the drivers will also be eligible to score points in the driver standings. And we already have our first one for Saudi Arabia, and it's quite appropriate for the whole round, because the driver for Jeddah is Rima Jafali, who will run in the 4th Prema seat, as mentioned. She made history in 2018 as the first ever female racing driver from Saudi Arabia. She's previously run in British F4, the Jaguar E-Pace I-Trophy, and she had a stint in GB3 in 2021, which then was followed by a successful endurance racing debut, where she finished second in her class at the 2022 Dubai 24 Hours. She then also went on to found her own team, Motorsport, which had a nice livery, if I remember correctly. It was just a nice subtle kind of, not quite turquoise blue, but that kind of teal green and white combination, which is quite nice. And she did that to improve Saudi Arabian access and participation in motorsport through educational and internship programs. The team secured victory in 2022 in the International GT Open, which was their debut year, which made her the first Saudi Arabian woman to win an international motor race. So pretty big deal all round, and understandable why she gets to have this wildcard entry, and almost a shame that it's just going to be the one race we see her in. But again, maybe this is something that will open up other opportunities in other categories, and who knows what the grid's going to look like next year. It'll be interesting to see how many of the wildcards we see come back for permanent seats next year. And as well, the team went on to bring home the Vice Championship title in the series' Pro-Am class. So they weren't a team to kind of mess around with. They kind of hit the ground running there. So well worthy of the wildcard entry. And as we were saying about the drivers that are definitely there all year, coming from a different background, not really single-seater, where she's very strong in the endurance world, as we've just seen from her kind of recap of her career so far. So again, like Leah Block, like Kerry Triner, it's going to be interesting to see how that transfers over and what she can apply from that racing style into the single-seater. But also remembering that this is just a one-off, so it's hard to know how much emphasis to put on all of it until afterwards. And even then, we've got to remember that it's a one-off, but still very intrigued to see how it goes and who else we might get later on, mainly because we don't know where the other wildcard regions are going to be yet. Miami seems like it could be an interesting one because of American races that we've seen. We're looking at Lindsay Brewer, for example, just now. Maybe that's something that happens later. There's a few other American drivers that would be worthy of that. I'm just thinking of the calendar now as well, of where it would be logical to do it. Silverstone maybe as well as one of them, just because we've got a host of drivers there that would be up for doing a one-off. But it's going to be interesting to see, and maybe that's something that we'll predict at a later point, or it will just be very interesting to see who will turn up for that, and then how that translates over to the grid in 2025. And more importantly, as it's a one-off race, and it's the first one of the season, if she can beat any of the other drivers out of the box, that's going to be pretty interesting to see as well, to see how she meets up against people, especially the more experienced drivers that were there last year, or just have more single-seater experience.
So obviously she's got sort of Saudi Arabian sort of history. She's Saudi Arabian and set records for that. So it makes sense that she's got the Jeddah round. You've already mentioned sort of possibly Lindsay Brewer for the Miami round, obviously an American driver. That still leaves Spain, Zandvoort, Singapore, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi as sort of open opportunities. And if we're sort of picking from sort of local talent pools, there's a lot of underrepresented areas on there as well. Obviously, Spain and Zandvoort fairly represented, but there's still a couple of others that really interesting.
Qatar and Abu Dhabi intrigue me because no names are coming straight to mind, which I love because it means we'll get new blood. Because as much as I enjoyed the grid that we've got this year, I know everyone. And I'm kind of annoyed at that in some ways because I would have liked there to be one or two people like, ooh, who's this person? Because next year, a lot of them, because of what we'll talk about in a second, won't be able to come back even if they want to. So we're going to have to get some fresh blood at some point, and this is a perfect way to try and scout out who's around.
And sort of Singapore, Qatar and Yas Marina will sort of be areas that are familiar or open to drivers that will be competing in things like Middle Eastern F4, the sort of there's the Indian F4 racing series as well. So there are drivers that are kicking around in these talent pools that will be familiar to these areas or sort of native to these countries, which means that we'll be looking in places that otherwise Formula 1, Formula 2, Formula 3, other feeder series don't tend to source talent from. So on a sort of a global scale, this is actually really well picked in the races that F1 Academy is attending and sort of racing at this year, and the way that it's going to be picking these wildcard seats. So yeah, it's really great on a diversity standpoint as well.
I think the most important thing that's going to have to obviously come out of the wildcard is that if they are good drivers, that something does come out of it. And what may come out of it is that they then get a seat Aussie and F1 Academy next year, as there is a 2-year cap to encourage progression and support rising talent. An additional update this year has been made to the sporting regulations to specify that drivers may only compete in 2 seasons of F1 Academy. The introduction of this rule sort of will ensure that every year there are opportunities for the most talented young women coming through karting and single-seater series ranks to compete in the series. You've got to think that's going to be a big change up to the lineup next year. 10 out of the 15 drivers, this will be their second season. You've got Bianca Bustamante, Carrie Schreiner, Chloe Chambers, Nuria Marti, the Alcobacy sisters, Emily DeHoos, Abby Pulling, Lola Lovenfoss, and Jessica Edker. And that means what all of Campos, Rodin, and MP Motorsport drivers are gone next year. But if they're going to put those sort of measures in place, those that may have not won the championship or come second, but show immense talent, or well, to be honest, anyone that shows immense talent, there needs to be the opportunity for them to step up. Because if a driver has shown sort of that exceptional talent through F1 Academy and then has driven in the series for 2 years and then is yet to find a motorsport series to progress into, is that going to sort of be the end of their career?
Hopefully not. And also, just as a final point on that, in terms of what next year looks like, I was just looking at the driver list from last year, because there are a few drivers that are this year that could then come back for a second year next year. And there is the kind of bit of strategy at play in terms of how you want to do your career, because it's 2 years, but it doesn't say anything about consecutive. So if we know Megan Gilks isn't going to come back because she's going to go and work for Aston Martin, but if you're Chloe Chong, Chloe Grant, or Maita Cáceres, you can come back in 2025 and give it another bite of the apple, essentially. And that's also quite a nice option, I think, for drivers to have, because if they come in straight away last year, you've kind of got a new series, you've untested, then everyone piles on for this year, and it's going to be a super competitive season. And you expect that to be next year as well. But then maybe, especially as we were saying, a lot of these drivers are very young. If you've got that with these 3 drivers as well, which you do, then it gives them time to get that exposure in that first year, go and see what they can do elsewhere, maybe come back if they want to, because they have that option for that second year. So I think that's a nice blend to have there, and also means that there's an element of continuity, which it may not happen a lot going forward, but there's that possibility for it, which I think is just a fun thing, because you don't often get that with feeder series too much. You only really get them in Formula 2, I feel like. But even then, as we've seen countless times, Jesse, it's a lot of the time it's drivers who probably shouldn't have stayed for as long as they have that are there for the longest time, whereas this time it's 2 years, and you kind of can't lose because you get a good bit of exposure because you're young coming into the category. You're not going to be old leaving it, let's face it. and you either sidestep somewhat or you just got enough exposure to help you with sponsorship, getting something somewhere else anyway. So either way, there's a lot of advantages to be there.
The sponsorship and exposure argument is a really strong one because, as we've already mentioned, how strong the sort of sponsorship and the recognition of F1 Academy already is. As that moves forward, as drivers sort of graduate from it, they'll come away from it with essentially sort of an apprenticeship almost in being in motorsport. And one of the things that W Series is doing a lot of this year is driver training when it comes to sort of media, when it comes to working with teams, when it comes to engineering and development. It's producing not just good racing drivers, but good members of a motorsports team. And they're coming out of this as far more rounded than you'd anticipate from something like GB3, GB4, F2000 Freckers.
Well, it's that international element to it, whereas you're going around the globe, you're on the same ticket as F1, you've got the backing of, if not an F1 team, than a global brand. And it's kind of one of those things where if you're going to another category, people look at your CV and go, ooh, F1 Academy. They know that immediately there. Whereas nothing against the other series that you mentioned there, but everyone's like, oh, what's this one? I just need to double check this if they're not quite familiar with it. Was you even forget about the Academy side, but they'll see F1 and be like, yes, you come in.
But it's the additional stuff that F1 Academy is actively teaching. It's holding courses for marketing. It's holding courses for sort of presentations and sort of how to understand engineering. It is producing far more than just a quick racing driver in the sort of amassed talent of 15 people it's got on its grid. And that's going to be the important thing moving forwards as well. And it's going to be understood because of the popularity of the branding of F1 Academy. You're going to look at it and go, oh yeah, but that's the one with the drivers that are coming out, knowing how to sort of understand marketing. So when you go to these bigger teams, you go to sort of your Premas, your Camposes in F3, F2, you move over to sort of things like Jota, you move over to Porsche and Penske in sort of endurance. Those are teams that go, oh, yeah, you've got talents that we can actively utilize and bring you into our race teams sooner and move you up the ranks sooner. You become a far more valuable asset, not just because you're a quick driver, but because you understand all the other facets of modern motorsport. You look at like the people that are coming into F3 these days, like we looked at the new guys coming in and we go, we've not heard of many of these. If you're coming from F1 Academy, you've had that A, exposure, but B, you've been taught how to appropriately manufacture that exposure, how to deal with it, how to actively sort of publicize yourself and make yourself a marketable
in
thing.
theory, we should be getting a lot more Oscar Piastris where they come in and they're just cool as a cucumber and just nailing everything straight away. Whereas you see some of the drivers that are only a few years older than him and they're not quite bungling it, but they like, why are you not being as professional as this guy? And they're coming in and with the double standards that exist a lot of the time for women in motorsport, they'll be able to quash all of that immediately by just being right on the mark and going, if you're going to criticize me, it's because I'm not good on track or I'm not quite getting the race on. It's not going to be for any of this stuff because I'm nailing that down.
It's producing a set of hyper-professional racing drivers, and I think that is going to be more valuable than anything else, especially when inevitably there is a cap on the amount of seats available in F2, F3, and F1. When you start looking elsewhere, all of a sudden being seen as a professional and exceptionally so professional racing driver, that will get you a long way. And if you've already got backing from big international brands, more so to it.
And if you are sort of then naturally progressing to sort of F3 and F2, some of these drivers may then already have a relationship with the team that they then go into, like Prema. So hopefully it will be sort of it'll be nice.
Good things.
Yeah, good things will hopefully going to happen, which I think brings us nicely on to what we think our predictions are going to be for the year. We'll start with you, Jesse.
I've sort of already alluded to this one, but counter to how they're doing in F2 and F3, certainly at the moment after one round, Prema will absolutely smash it and will have, at the very least, a three-way fight for the title. In an ideal world, and this speaks a lot for my favouritism, Dorian Pin will take the title.
I'm going to say smash it may turn out to be a very poor choice of words.
As long as they can do better than they're doing in F2 and F3, that's all I'm asking for at this point. Like, I feel so bad for Ollie Behrman and Kimi Antonelli at the moment. That was not the weekend they wanted to.
And Dino Beganovic.
Dino Beganovic as well. Just it's been rough, man. It's a hard time being a Ferrari fan and a Prema fan right now.
Really?
Oh.
Okay. No, I'll go for it. If I'll feel the suspense for yours. I present you with. Yeah, I'm going to go for a similar prediction to what I had last year, in part in that because it's been awesome to see every driver on the podium at least once this season, which I don't know if that includes wildcards or not, because that would be ballsy, but I quite like that idea as well, because that means they're all going to have stonking times of it. And then, as I also alluded to a little bit earlier, because I think she's underrated, I'm going to say, despite the experience and speed that she has, I'm going to say Neri Marty goes for the title and gets it.
Nice.
Ellie May, yours?
Well, Jesse kind of took mine in that I think Dorian Pin will be sort of a force to be reckoned with. So I think where we've now got this sort of 2-year cap, those that were sort of in the inaugural season of F1 Academy are obviously really going to have to step up if they want to prove what they've got and sort of find that natural step up. So I think we are going to see sort of some really tight battles. So maybe that sort of goes into Thiemo's prediction as well, that somehow we end up with all of them on a podium. But I'm going to say that
they're all crossing the line at the same time with no time splitting them, so they're all on the podium at once.
Don't need a bigger podium. I'm going to say that Hamda Al-Khabaisi wins the championship.
I'm not against that as a backup for my prediction. She's speedy. She's a lot of fun. She's a great prankster. I can't fault it.
And that's all we've got time for this week's episode, but we'll be back soon with a preview for the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And if you want more feeder series content from us, check out our F2 and F3 season previews. That's out now. And check back with us throughout the year as we review all feeder series actions from across Formula 2, Formula 3, and F1 Academy. In the meantime, Jesse, where can the people find you?
Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok is at Jesse on Cars and writing for Classic Car Weekly. When this goes out, our latest issue will be out, and it features some futuristic reimaginings of some British classic cars in the wake of the MG Cyberster and the Machina TR2. So some interesting bits and quite futuristic for us. Very much so.
Thiemo?
You can find me over on Is It Fast, Paddock Sorority, Nitro RX podcast. We've got some fun interviews coming up over there. And on the Kerbs, of course, where there's an interview out with Maria Fiorio at the moment, who's a bundle of fun, and hopefully she gets a bit more exposure as well at some point in the off-road racing that she's more known for. I don't think she's going to be in F1 Academy anytime soon, mainly because she's above the age cap, but she's very fun in rallying. And if you ever want to learn how to drive a bit better or in a more fun racing style rally way, she also teaches, so that's worth a trip to Italy. Ellie May, where can people find you?
I will hopefully for International Women's Day, keeping with the theme of sort of female empowerment.
You're going to Saudi Arabia.
I wish. But unfortunately I will be staying in the four walls of my house, and I will be producing sort of a little series on women in motorsport, covering sort of various sectors of it, and our first one will be out on Racing Drivers on Friday.
Very nice.
I'm looking forward to seeing that.
Thank you for listening. We'll see you again soon. XOXO.